Kuki Shinobu is currently our first and only Electro Healer here in Genshin Impact 2.7, and because she's our only Electro Healer, a lot of people are finding her valuable within her niche, however are having a hard time building her because some of her scalings can be a little bit confusing. Hi, my name's Blossums and welcome to another Genshin Impact video, and today we're going to be going over our Kuki Shinobu build guide here, going over the main stats you're going to want to go for, as well as some of the decisions you might want to make based on how you're going to be playing your Kuki Shinobu. But before we get into it, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed this kind of content. It helps me out a ton and I really appreciate it. Before we get into her actual build, we need to know a little bit about her kit, some of the stats you're going to want to be looking for, as well as her general playstyle and how she wants to operate in teams. But first, we'll go ahead and talk about her normal attacks. There's nothing really interesting or new going on here. You're not going to be dealing a ton of damage with these or anything. There is one small thing to where she does like a fan of knives that does a small amount of AoE, which is pretty cool, but for the most part, you can ignore this entirely. Most of her kit is, however, going to be revolving around her E skill, and the way her E skill works is you cast it, it takes away 30% of your current HP, and then for a duration of 12 seconds, it heals you every 1.5 seconds for a percentage of her max HP, and also deals a little bit of electro damage and a small AoE. This electro damage does scale off of attack, which is a little weird, but we'll get into that later. However, you will notice that the downtime on this E skill is only 3 seconds, which is really nice, meaning that you can keep very consistent electro off-field application and consistent healing pretty much indefinitely. The little 3 seconds there is not much of a downtime. It's just pretty much the time you're going to be swapping to her, using her E skill, and then, you know, going back to whatever character you're using. And this healing only pertains to the character that is currently on the field, so that is something that you do need to know. You might have to play a little bit of juggling with your characters to make sure they get healed enough, but for the most part, since this is almost always active, generally you're going to be healing everybody, which I find very nice. Next up is their Elemental Burst, and this is often overlooked because it doesn't contribute to healing in any way or anything, so a lot of people just write it off because they're using her as a healer. However, the way this works is very similar to Amber's Elemental Burst in the fact that you use it, and for a small duration it does electro damage in an AoE, and this duration is increased if she's below 50% HP, and the duration here is pretty small, 2 to 3.5 seconds, and it does scale off of your max HP for the damage. However, these takes are still relatively low because it's a small percent of your max HP, and then it just adds up to a certain total, and that's kind of how that works. However, you will note that this is dealing continuous electro damage, and yes, you can get multiple reactions within the Elemental Burst if you're using it with somebody who's applying another element pretty quickly, so that's pretty nice. And if you build her for Elemental Mastery, which we'll get into in just a second, you can actually dish out some pretty interesting damage with this. However, you don't really need to level this up that much if you don't want to. As I said, the damage numbers really aren't going to be coming from this. It's going to be coming from the Elemental Mastery if you're building into it and building a team around that. So yeah, your talent priority is going to be your E skill, then your Elemental Burst, and if you really want to, you can level up those normal attacks, but you don't need to at all, in my opinion. For passives, however, where things get pretty interesting, the first one, Breaking Free, here is when Shinobu's HP is now higher than 50%, her healing bonus is increased by 15%, which is almost always going to be active because, as we mentioned before, she has very low downtime on her E skill, so often you're going to be casting her E skill and then swapping to another character, so she's often not going to be getting the healing that she's providing, meaning that she's almost always going to be having this 15% bonus, meaning your healing on your other characters is going to be more effective. Her next passive is probably the most important. Basically, Sanctifying Ring's abilities will be boosted based off Shinobu's Elemental Mastery. Healing amount will be increased by 75% for the Elemental Mastery, and the damage dealt is increased by 25% of Elemental Mastery. And this is pretty interesting because not only do they want to have you build it into HP percent, they were leaning towards a little bit of attack, but then now they're adding Elemental Mastery in the mix, and this is where a lot of people get confused. However, I think Elemental Mastery is very worth investing into Kuki Shinobu, and we'll be going over that in just a little bit. This passive is pretty darn important and an integral part to her kit, in my opinion. So obviously you'll want to be investing into her HP due to the fact that her E skill's healing scales off of HP and her Elemental Burst damage scales off of HP. And even though her E skill's damage does scale off of attack, even if you invest full into it, it's still not going to be dealing good damage just because that has inherently low modifiers. So I don't think it's invest really going into attack at all. Instead, HP is going to be the way to go, but also Elemental Mastery because of her passive Heart's Repose. Because Elemental Mastery, you have to remember, does scale really well with some of the Electro reactions, like Electro Charged and Overload, and if you invest into that elemental mastery, it's not only going to be increasing your damage substantially for those reactions, it's also still going to be helping out your healing and the E skills damage in general because of that passive Heart's Repose. And that's why elemental mastery, I think, is so important on her. So I think the main focuses for her are going to be HP percent, elemental mastery, and then some energy recharge where you can find it. Next up, we'll talk about some artifact sets for Kuki Shinobu, and realistically, if you're looking for a 4-piece set on her, I don't think there's a better option than Tenacity of the Millelith. It gives you HP percent, and then whether she's on the field or not, when her elemental skill does some damage, it increases the party's HP by 20% and shield strength by 30%, which is just an all-around nice passive bonus you're giving to the whole team, which is really good. If you really want to use some of the other 4-piece sets, you can. Something like Ocean Hued Clam is fine, but do know that she is likely not going to be hitting the maximum on Ocean Hued Clam in the same way that Kokomi would, so the damage here isn't that crazy for her. However, this is still a solid set. Healing bonus is nice, and then getting that extra damage is pretty nice as well. Something like the Maiden's Beloved is also pretty cool because you get some extra healing effectiveness, and then when you use her skill or burst, you also get more healing effectiveness, and even though her burst doesn't heal, you're likely still going to be healing from the E skill whenever you use her burst, so you could get some more healing bonus that way, which is cool. So those are all fine, but realistically, the best option is going to be that Tenacity of the Millelith. It is just that good on her. But don't fret if you can't get a 4-piece Tenacity of the Millelith. You do still have some split set options, things like Tenacity of the Millelith, and splitting it up with something like Wondrous Troop is really good because you get that extra 80 elemental mastery there, which is very nice. You can also split it up with something like Emblem of Severed Fate for some extra energy recharge if you really want to. And even though I don't think energy recharge is all that valuable on Kuki Shinobu, it of course does still help and adds a little bit more damage overall. And if you just can't find a 4-piece of the Tenacity of the Millelith and maybe a 2-piece of the Wondrous Troop, then that's a solid option overall. But of course you could just do a 2-piece of the Maiden's Beloved and 2-piece Tenacity, 2-piece Ocean Hued Clam and 2-piece Tenacity. So you have plenty of options when it comes to split sets, and I think the best split set is going to be that Tenacity and Wondrous Troop option, but you do have plenty of options to choose from depending on the artifacts that you have. Main stats are where things get pretty interesting on Kuki Shinobu because there's a lot of different ways that you can actually do this. And if you just want to focus in on healing, you can do HP percent for the Sands and the Goblet, and then do healing bonus on the Circlet, and that'll net you the best healing. You could of course do HP percent on the Circlet as well, but she's already getting so much HP percent from Tenacity of the Millelith and her Hidden Ascension bonus that healing bonus just tends to be better for her in healing overall there. And even though this healing is solid, it's very good, and you're boosting your healing because of the HP percent, and you're boosting the damage on your elemental burst because of the HP percent, I don't recommend going this route. Instead, I would focus more heavily into elemental mastery and trying to get as many elemental mastery main stats as you can. And the reason for this is because, as I just mentioned, she's already getting some free HP percentage from her Hidden Ascension bonus there. And then if you're using something like Tenacity of the Millelith, you're getting an extra 20% already. So she's getting plenty for free from those two sources. And then if you just use one main stat HP percent, then you're getting most of the healing that you would be if you went all in on it. So instead, my recommended build for Kuki Shinobu is actually going to be HP percent and then 2 elemental mastery main sets here. I just don't have an elemental mastery piece in the Tenacity of the Millelith set, so I'm unfortunately forced to use double HP, but that's fine too. I would, however, recommend trying to get both of those elemental mastery main stats, and the reason for this is substantially going to amp up your electro charge damage as well as your overload damage, and since she's consistently applying that electro application off of the field, this is very good. It often makes her the one causing the reactions as well, and you can deal some solid reaction damage this way. And the healing that you lose really isn't that substantial. And to put it into perspective, the healing you lose is actually pretty small. If we do the full healing build that we were talking about earlier of 2 HP percent main stats and then a healing bonus circlet, and we compare it to the build with 1 HP percent main stat and 2 elemental mastery main stats, you actually only lose about 700-ish health per tick of healing, which really isn't that big. And if you're doing full HP percent, you're only losing about 300 health per tick of healing. So you're not losing that much healing, and the damage you gain from the elemental mastery is in the thousands per elemental reaction of those reactions of elemental or electro charge and overload. So I think Elemental Mastery is much more valuable on her because this is also still contributing to her healing, but also allowing her to actually dish out some damage for the team. So yeah, HP percentage, Elemental Mastery, and Elemental Mastery are the way that I personally recommend to go. And the nice part about this is that it doesn't have to be in a particular slot. You could have Elemental Mastery for your Circleting Goblet and have HP on your Sands, or you could have HP on your Circlet and Elemental Mastery on your Goblet or Sands, wherever you happen to get them, because they can actually roll on all three of those artifact slots, which is nice. There is, however, another way that you can build Kuki Shinobu, and this is for a particular weapon for the most part, and that is to put a crit rate circlet on her in some capacity, or just have a bunch of crit rate substats, and that's only if you're trying to go for the Favonius Sword to generate energy for the rest of your team via the neutral particles it generates. I don't really recommend this because it doesn't lend itself to her kit all that well, and we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get into the actual weapons, but that also is an option. And don't worry if all that main set talk confused you a little bit, we are going to actually be showcasing the differences between those in the actual showcase portion of the video, so stick around for that. But for now, let's go ahead and talk about the substats. And of course, the substats are mostly going to revolve around wanting HP percent as much as possible, and then Elemental Mastery as much as possible, and then trying to find energy recharge where you can is also pretty important. Getting her Elemental Burst isn't all that, vital for her because it's not like it's contributing to your healing. However, it does do those multiple instances of electro damage, so if you are trying to leverage those elemental reactions like Electro Charge and Overload or something like that, then getting the Elemental Burst as much as you can be pretty valuable, but I don't think it's valuable to the point that it should be a main set. I would just mostly look for some of those substats, trying to hit into the tens of your energy recharge, and then that'll get you your Elemental Burst consistently enough. The substats you'll be looking for are HP percent, Elemental Mastery, and Energy Recharge, and then of course things like attack percent or crit rate or something are going to be just nice additions. They shouldn't be focuses that you go for, but if you get them, they're pretty nice overall because they'll just be contributing a little bit to your damage. Unfortunately, as for weapons for Kuki, she doesn't really have that many options. You could of course use any of the energy recharge options, but as I said before, you really don't need that much to get her Elemental Burst, and her Elemental Burst isn't all that valuable for her kit, so leaning into energy recharge really isn't that crazy for her, and these swords just aren't that good for her, especially something like Sack Sword because you only have 3 seconds of downtime on your E skill anyway. Pocketing another is not really all that valuable. Favonius Sword is pretty good because it does generate some neutral particles, and that can help your teammates get their bursts back faster, which is really nice, and leaning into that is actually pretty valuable. But other than that, we don't have any HP percent substat swords. The only thing that has HP percent involved is really the Primordial Jade Cutter, where you get 20% for free. You get some extra attack and you get some crit rate, and overall this is a pretty decent option for her. But realistically, if you have this, you should probably be using it on a character that actually deals some damage and not her. So I think I actually recommend something like the Iron Sting because it has an Elemental Mastery passive, which is going to be increasing our damage. Its actual passive itself is pretty solid overall. But if you're using that on somebody like Kazuha, or it's just taken up, or maybe you don't have one, you also have the 3-star option of the Dark Iron Sword. That also has an Elemental Mastery subset and increases attack if you do an electro-based reaction here. So that's pretty nice, and this is a decent option too. But other than that, we really don't have that many options yet. Until we get like an HP percent substat sword, I really recommend something like Iron Sting. Now, Constellations for Kuki are actually pretty good. All of them are pretty solid. I don't think any of them are necessary, but all of them certainly accent her kit. The first one being that the AoE of your E skill is increased by 50%, meaning it's going to be easier to apply that electro to enemies, which is very nice. And then the C2 makes it to where your E skill has literally 0 downtime now. The C4 making it to where when your E skill actually hits opponents, it'll mark them and deal AoE electro damage, making that electro application even more consistent. And then the C6 here is basically whenever she dies, she gets resurrected and at 1 health, which is actually pretty good because oftentimes she's not going to be receiving the healing that she's dishing out for the team. So if you swapped her at the wrong time by accident and she dies, then that really sucks, and that can happen a lot. So having the C6 is just a nice quality of life there. And then not only that, but it also gives you some extra elemental mastery whenever she's below 25%. So yeah, overall, these are fantastic, and I would recommend some of them. I think they're all pretty good. I don't think any of them are necessary, as I said, but none of them are bad or anything. Team comps for Kuki Shinobu are going to be relatively simple. As we mentioned before, she's going to excel in things like Electro Charge and Overload just because of the whole elemental mastery side of her kit. And thankfully, because she's a healer, it allows us to leverage more DPS-oriented Hydro characters or that Electro Charge team comp, and also allows us to use characters like Kazuha instead of being used to forced to use one of our Animo healers or something. So yeah, you could use people like Ayato, you could use people like Child, you could use people like Mona, and you could pair those characters together, which you couldn't really do before because it kind of blocked you off from some of your healers. And Kuki Shinobu will likely be the one proccing those Electro Charge, so that's very nice. It really opens up some new Electro Charge team comps. And you can also just pair her with some of our other Electro characters that are really good in Electro Charge. That's fine too. You don't have to do the like Animo thing that I was just doing right there. That'll be really good for some energy recharge stuff and allow everybody to get their burst. And overall, she's going to fit really well in Electro Charge. And although I mentioned she'd be good in Overloaded, and she would be, a lot of our Pyro characters don't really lend themselves to the way her E skill applies Pyro. What I mean by that is like, characters like Yoimiya and Yanfei are ranged, so they're going to be farther away from the enemy, so the ring won't really hit those enemies. And then characters like Hu Tao want to be lower HP, so she doesn't want to be healed continuously, so she can't really take advantage of the Kuki Shinobu kit at all. And then really the only one that lends himself to her kit is maybe Diluc, and that way you could get some overloads going on. But until we get a Pyro character that wants to be a little bit more close quarters while dealing their Pyro stuff, she doesn't really pair too well with a lot of the current Pyro characters we have. We could do somebody like Bennett or Xiangling if you really wanted to. I think those are really good options. But for the most part, there just isn't a Pyro character that goes super well with her right now. So hopefully we'll get one in the future. And of course, Kuki is going to be really good in some of those physical DPS compositions as well, just because she applies Electro off field. So if you have a character like Eula, that's some free Superconduct. And then it also opens up slots like Rosaria, so you don't have to use Diona anymore because Kuki's there. I talked about this a little bit in the previous video that we made talking about Kuki Shinobu, but yeah, this opens up some new physical DPS stuff. You could have Razor here and then some other cryo characters that you enjoy. But yeah, she works in those teams pretty well too. And although I say Kuki Shinobu isn't really good with a lot of our Pyro characters because they want to be at range or some other reasons, there is a little bit of an exception to this. And what I'm talking about is actually a team much like this, where you're using Yoimiya, Kazuha, and Yelan to, of course, get your Vaporizes and group up enemies and deal a bunch of damage that way. And that's fantastic already, and normally just pair another healer with them. But when you think about it, having Yoimiya here with Kuki Shinobu allows you to overload occasionally, knocking back opponents away from Yoimiya, which is good because Yoimiya wants to be at a distance for her bow shots. And also when you're grouping enemies with Kazuha, if you cause an overload, that overload is going to happen to a bunch of enemies because of the fact that overload does an AoE in the first place, allowing you to deal some good damage that way. So although Kuki wouldn't be the focus here in this team to be dishing out some good Electro damage, it would still happen occasionally, and it might allow you to also get Electro charged and overload at the same time, which can happen, and really increase your damage that way. So that's one thing I wanted to mention, that she could be utilized in that way, and maybe something a lot of people aren't thinking about. Alright, so now we'll go ahead and show off the different main stats and how much they're healing for. We'll start off with the full healing build of having the double HP percent and the healing bonus there. And you will notice that I've actually got some pretty good Elemental Mastery substats, and that puts us around 400 Elemental Mastery there, which is pretty good because we'll be getting a 277% increase to our Overloaded, Electrocharge, Shattered, Swirl, and Superconduct there, which is pretty cool. It represents an actually pretty good version of this build. We're sitting at 31k HP. Let's go ahead and see just how much healing we're getting. And when we cast the E skill, we're getting about 3200 per tick. And no, we are not under the 50% threshold there, so we're not getting the additional 15% healing bonus from her passive there. But yeah, 3200 per tick around for that build. Next up, we'll show the full HP percentage build here, which is just kind of another version of that healing build where we just have all HP percentage here. This one has a little bit less Elemental Mastery, so we're only sitting around 360, and we don't have any of that healing bonus percentage like we did before. But now we're at 37k HP, about 6k more. So let's go ahead and see how much that heals for, and you'll see that it heals for a little bit less, about 500 to 600 less there at 2600. And yeah, so it's just a little bit worse than the other one. Now let's go ahead and show off the double elemental mastery main stat pieces here. And do notice that we don't have the 4-piece tenacity of the Millith set going on and most of these, but that's fine because that's not contributing to our healing or anything. It just increases our attack when it actually hits opponents and stuff. So just keep that in mind. But we do have the 2-piece for all of these sets, which is very nice. But we'll go ahead and show off the elemental mastery version of the build. And you'll notice my elemental mastery is nearly 700 here, about 300-ish more than the full healing build there. And you'll see that we're actually getting 400% increased damage for our electro charge and our overload stuff there. So that is substantially more than the 277 that we were getting before. But let's actually see how much healing that one in particular is doing. And you'll notice that it is less, and it's dealing 2300 per tick, nearly 2400 there. So from 3200 to 2400 for losing 2 main stats really isn't that huge, and you're still healing plenty here. But let's go ahead and show the damage differences between the two. So first up, we'll use the full healing build with its 400 elemental mastery there, and we'll go ahead and use some electro charge on some of these treasure hoarders so we can use them as a little bit of a test case here. Apply Hydro to this guy. Go back to her, use her E skill, and you see we did about 4,300 there. And then on an overload, we did about 7,300 there, which is pretty good. And we'll go ahead and show the full elemental mastery and see the differences between those. So now we're on the full elemental mastery build with about 700 elemental mastery. Let's go ahead and check out how that goes. We'll get the electro charge going. You see we did 5,800 there, so about 1,000 more, a little bit over 1,000 more. Let's go ahead and see how Pyro reacts. You see we did 9,800 there. Next up, we'll go ahead and show her off in floor 12 of the Spiral Abyss. And keep in mind during this gameplay, I'm going to have 2 HP main stats in 1 Elemental Mastery main stat, just so I can keep my 4-piece Tenacity of the Millith bonus, because I still don't have an Elemental Mastery piece for it. So if the reaction damage is a little bit lower than it was previously, then that's why, and you know why. And then after that, we'll go ahead and give our conclusions on her and my thoughts on her overall. So yeah, overall, Kuki Shinobu isn't a crazy unit or anything. She's not dealing a bunch of damage, but she is a solid electro healer, and the elemental mastery side of things keeps things pretty interesting for some really cool team compositions like the ones I mentioned before. And with Dendro right around the corner, I really won't be surprised if it reacts with electro, and I think Kuki's going to be a really good option for those kinds of teams, and I really look forward to how they actually play out. So hopefully this guide actually helped you out a bit. She was a little bit confusing with how some of those stats were working out. Hopefully I simplified that for you and helped you determine how you're going to want to build your Kuki Shinobu, as I think she's a very cool character, and the more that I looked into her kit, the more I actually started to appreciate her, and hopefully you are too. But other than that, hope you guys have a fantastic rest of your day. I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.